If you didn't notice before now, this channel reached 1,000 subscribers about a month ago, so I'd like to thank everyone who has decided to subscribe and watch my videos as they release. While I do what I do because I enjoy the process, it is motivating to some degree to know that there's an audience that's interested in what you have to say, even if it is relatively small in the grand scheme of things. Before getting into the questions, I'd like to mention that I've been allowed to set up the YouTube membership system on my channel. If you want to show financial support to me for whatever reason, this is probably the best way to do it for the time being. For now, I'll be providing 24-hour early access to every new video, as well as a unique member role in my Discord server for members, though I'm open to adding more perks as time goes on. That's all in terms of channel updates, so now let's get into the questions. A note for those of you who asked questions is that I have reworded some of the questions slightly, but the spirit of the original version should still be there. So let's get into that. Why did you start making videos? I thought I'd start with this classic YouTuber Q&A question, since it pretty much goes back to the beginning for me. Ever since I first went on YouTube, probably around 10 years ago, I was always most interested in the heavily prepared, scripted content. I recall enjoying videos from the Normal Boots crew, and generally the more comedic style of the early 2010s gaming content that grew out of that audience, though this style has definitely fallen out of favor in recent years. When you're young and impressionable, you want to grow up to be like the people you watch in media, so I always considered YouTube as a possibility for me to try. Thankfully, I didn't act on any of those considerations, since they would have been incredibly embarrassing, especially if I started when I was really into Minecraft. Generally, I always thought I would wait until I'm older, for the same reason I never used voice chat in multiplayer games. I just didn't think my voice or maturity level was there yet, and I was, and still am, a decently shut-in person. But starting around 2017, there was a huge resurgence in the heavily scripted content space, as the term video essay picked up a lot of steam, and was mostly spearheaded by leftist political commentators, some of whom also talked about video games in much the same format. While I enjoyed the more political videos for a time, the dissections of games that were done in this format were always more interesting to me, and have generally aged better in my eyes. Compared to earlier content about video games, video essays were much more serious and analytical, and they didn't necessarily need to be consistently comedic, which greatly appealed to me in terms of how I would want to write. Eventually, there was a combination of factors that led me to make my first video about Night in the Woods. I had already been writing smaller reviews for games on an Instagram account to an audience of about 10 to 20 people tops, but I wanted to do something more in-depth and long-form, and the events of March 2020 led to me having a huge surplus of free time. But more importantly, arguably the biggest creator in the video essayist space, HBomberGuy, had previously teased his own video about Night in the Woods a year or two ago at the time. I still await that video's release, so I can finally unsubscribe from his channel, but the important thing is that I eventually realized I had my own detailed thoughts on the game that I was capable of talking about for a good chunk of time, which slowly led to me making my first video. So in a way, I partly started this channel out of a bit of spite, which is funny to look back on. Where did the name Cheddar come from? To tell this story as simply as possible, in middle school I had a small group of friends, and one day they asked me what my middle name was. I told them to guess, the only hint being that it was a cheese that started with C. Obviously, their immediate first guess was Cheddar. It was a funny enough story that I decided to make it my name on Steam, and I lazily drew a slice out of a cheese wheel in paint for my profile picture. I like to think it's a neat origin story of sorts for the name, and it's a lot better and more memorable than whatever I was going by before that point. What is your favorite and least favorite video on your channel? I do rewatch my complete videos when I'm bored or procrastinating sometimes, and I obviously have a unique perspective on them since I'm the owner of both the voice and thoughts depicted. In terms of full-length essays, I find my video on Ultra Deluxe to be the best, in part because I had been waiting for years to not just play the game, but to make a video about it as well. The video itself turned out quite well, even though it was the most I pushed myself to release quickly. Though I would probably tweak some parts of the script to sound a bit less harsh on the game, I do think it was one of my more interesting videos nonetheless. But in terms of every video I've released, I have a soft spot for the video I made about chicory about a year ago. I find the game design problem I talk about in that video intensely interesting and how unique and paradoxical it is, and as I say in the description of the video, it's a script that I put a lot of thought into and synthesized a lot of feedback for. I find that it's one of my best scripts overall, which is why I come back to it more often than most of my others. In terms of my least favorite, I have to give something of a cop-out. I think the writing in my older videos is still decent, even though I have improved over the years. but what I can't get past is how bad my narration sounds. This is most obvious in the Night in the Woods video, since the microphone I used was bad, but in the Fez video I just mumbled half my lines, which makes it a lot less enjoyable to rewatch for me, knowing how much better it could have been. It's only at the Undertale video that I really developed a decent narration voice, though I would still get better over time. But I also received another question related to this topic. Have you ever wanted to change something about your older videos? Aside from fixing my voice in the first two videos, as well as some big editing errors and minor grammatical errors, there's not a lot I would change about my older stuff. The only video I would make foundational changes on would be the Undertale video, because it takes me around 50 minutes to get to what I actually want to talk about. A lot of that stuff was a holdover from a previous version of the script, where I was going to be much more critical of the game, most of which got unloaded onto the second unlisted video I made to accompany the main video. The last half hour or so was definitely my best work at the time, but there's a lot of fluff in front of it even if you cut out the story recap, so if I was going to make major changes to the contents of any video I've released so far, my first choice would be to make the Undertale video 45 minutes tops, instead of the completely unwarranted movie-length runtime I gave it. Do you ever plan on making videos that aren't related to games? I've already dipped my toes into this by talking about Taxi Driver in my video on Omori, and you can take the first third of that video as my heavily condensed analysis of Taxi Driver. Past using movies or other sorts of media to assist in talking about games, I'm probably not going to dedicate entire videos to them for two reasons. First, movies are much more prone to copyright issues on YouTube compared to games, as long as you don't talk about Nintendo games too much at least. In fact, the only copyright issue I've had so far has been for playing too much of the Taxi Driver theme uninterrupted in that video, and I've played a lot of uninterrupted music from games in the past with no issue. But second, and more personally, I don't have the same connection to movies as a medium in general as I do to games. I've put relatively little time into watching and thinking about movies compared to games, so I would definitely be on the back foot in that sphere. However, I won't completely rule out discussion of other forms of media in the future, especially if I find something novel and interesting to talk about. Are there any principles or ideals you aim for when making videos? My principles are mostly centered around how I write my scripts, since that's the real meat of my videos, and I can sum them up with two words: brevity and novelty. It's sort of a meme in the video essay landscape that a lot of the videos are brutally and needlessly long, which is part of what's been driving me away from watching them in recent days. When I would write things for school, I would always have trouble reaching word requirements rather than staying below word limits, so I think I've always had a knack for writing with brevity that seems to have translated into my scripts. I also try to make videos on topics that haven't been covered extensively by popular channels, not just for the potential allure that creates to my channel, but also because I find it boring to continually retread already covered ground. I think the closest I've come to breaking these two is, again, the Undertale video. But I decided that I had enough insights I hadn't heard before on such a popular game that it passed my bar for novelty, though I don't have an excuse for how bloated the video was. Other than that, these two principles in my writing haven't steered me wrong so far, so I expect I'll continue following them for a while. If you could send a message back in time to yourself when you started making the top, what would you say? Thanks to the person who asked this question for giving me the opportunity to talk about the top on the channel for the first time. I'm not interested in forcing myself to sneak in a reference every video to potentially boost my sales, and there are a few places I could have in the past several months. But to answer the question, I'm happy with the majority of the game, to the point where I wouldn't want to go back and change any of it. The only missed opportunities in my mind were born of my ineptitude at coding when I first started the project. It's the reason the game is locked at 60 FPS and at a 4:3 resolution, which are both things you need to have in mind at the very start of the coding process that can't be easily changed halfway through development, as much as I would have loved to. Aside from that, I've wondered whether or not I should have put the game up for free on Steam rather than putting any sort of price tag on it, though I'm much less decided on that front. But I am happy with all the actual game content at this point, which is what's really important for me personally. What's your favorite movie/TV show? I haven't considered my favorite movies as much as I've considered my favorite games, so I don't have a specific favorite as much as I have a collection of favorites. Taxi Driver is what I'll tell people is my favorite if they ask me, since it's the closest I have to a definitive favorite, but I'll quickly mention some others. I was really happy to see Everything Everywhere All at Once have a great show at the Oscars this year, since it's probably the best movie I've seen in theaters. I really enjoyed both The Lighthouse and Midsommar, which makes me want to see more from A24. The movies I've watched from the Coen brothers have been excellent, my favorites being The Ballad of Buster Scruggs and especially Fargo. I recently watched the Dark Knight trilogy, and the titular second film in the trilogy stood out to me as both very engaging and very interesting thematically. Hopefully that short list is a good summary of the kinds of movies I enjoy. I'm a lot less well versed on TV shows, since I've always used YouTube as my primary time killer, so I've only watched the biggest shows that my friends have recommended to me, those being Game of Thrones, Breaking Bad, and Better Call Saul. Of those three, I would probably give my number one to Better Call Saul, even though I haven't seen the final season yet, but all three are very good and worthwhile time sinks if you haven't touched them yet. Do you think games should always strive to be entertaining? This is a classic question surrounding narrative design in games that I did touch on briefly in my video about Ultra Deluxe, though not exactly in the way this question asks. The standard response for the games' art crowd is to say that games don't necessarily need to be entertaining, because having a game that is very hostile to the player, even to the point of frustration, can be powerful from a thematic perspective when put into a narrative context. You can point to examples like both the Pathologic games that build a very clear and powerful tonal core by creating a world that is actively hostile and unfair towards the player. But for me, Pathologic 2 is still a very entertaining game, though a better word might be engaging. Whatever word you choose, they're all a bit malleable and also very subjective. In my mind, if I don't find a game enjoyable to play in some respect, I wouldn't continue playing it. So I would say that Pathologic 2 in particular succeeded in being a very entertaining game, despite being among the go-to examples for this question. To me, it's more like you're trading off how enjoyable the game is to directly interact with for a stronger narrative, tonal, or thematic core. So in a way, I do think games should always strive to be entertaining, though there are some games that push boundaries in terms of where the entertainment comes from. But if the question was phrased as entertaining to play, I would say of course they don't need to, which I think is what this question is usually trying to get at. If you could erase a game from your memory so you could experience it for the first time again, what game would you choose? The first immediate answer to this question is Outer Wilds, for reasons that are obvious to anyone who has played through the game. But the reality is that I would do this for almost every single player game I play, because experiencing stories and learning about worlds and mechanics in games is something you can only do once for each game you play. From a perspective of personal happiness, this would completely remove the need for me to ever buy another game again, but I might not actually take this offer since it would undo most or all of the progress I've made towards this channel. But to give another possible answer, I do think it would be interesting to wipe my memory of the top, considering my relationship to the game. It's interesting that from a developer's perspective, you'll never be able to experience your own work blind, and since I made the top as a game that I think I would enjoy playing blind, it might even surpass Outer Wilds for me for this question. If you could change anything about your favorite game, what would it be? I've mentioned before that my favorite game is Terraria, and at this point in the game's life, it's tricky to find any glaring flaws, which is why it's my favorite game to some extent. I could make nitpicks, like how the second and third Old One's Army versions are brutally unfair on Master Mode, or that melee builds are a decent bit more powerful in a general sense compared to the other damage types by the endgame, but the reality is that Terraria is an incredibly well-polished game, to the point that I can't think of many significant things I would change about it. The game is also still going to be receiving at least one more update, so these things might even be tweaked in the future. What are your thoughts on the Mother series? I'm going to assume this question is referring to the Mother series that includes Earthbound, instead of some other Mother series I'm unaware of. I have actually played through some of Earthbound, though I never ended up finishing it. I've alluded to this before, but plain turn-based JRPG combat is really boring to me, and Earthbound definitely fell into that category. However, that isn't to say that these sorts of games can't succeed in other areas, but the game overall would be succeeding in spite of its gameplay and not because of it. And from what I've heard of it, Mother 3 is a game that could very well fit into that category for me. I'm aware of the very dark narrative elements present in the game, including its ending, though if the story and writing is good enough, I would likely still enjoy it despite having been spoiled. But regardless of whether or not I've played any of the games to completion, I still have a good amount of respect for the Mother series just because of how much influence it's had on indies over the years, and I just might get around to trying Mother 3 someday just because of that fact. What's your opinion on the game launcher situation with Epic, Ubisoft, and others, and is the Valve monopoly justified? It seems to me that the game launcher discourse has calmed down a good bit over the past couple years, especially since Epic has slowed down or entirely stopped signing exclusivity deals, but this is obviously an ongoing thing because of the ongoing Valve monopoly. There's a reason why Valve has maintained a stranglehold on the game's distribution market on PC, and it's because they not only have the most games and the most auxiliary features, but they also have very good consumer-friendly business practices all around. Just having user reviews, the refund system, and all the community components Steam hosts on its servers puts them leagues beyond the clunky and underdeveloped launcher and storefront Epic has. On top of this, the Steam Direct program has helped so many indie developers, including myself, put their game in front of a huge general audience, so obviously I have some bias there. Whenever Valve has made big mistakes, such as the paid mods thing that happened a while ago, it's been completely rolled back within a matter of days. If a company like Ubisoft had done paid mods, I think there's a very good chance they would have just pushed through the controversy and fought to make it the standard. So in that way, Valve is easily the best company to be running the biggest games aggregator. But at the same time, monopolies are never all good, and they're obviously antithetical to a healthy market system. So my final thought is that the monopoly itself is dangerous, but in terms of who runs the monopoly, there are very few companies who I would trust to run it more than Valve. So overall, I think we're in a good spot from both an individual consumer and developer perspective. Do you have any thoughts on what's been released so far with Animal Well? While all I can say for now is that the game looks okay, and that I'll probably wait for reviews to consider trying it for myself, this question is probably more so looking for my opinion on its connection to Dunkey. I don't think I'm that well versed on every single intricacy of this discussion, so I would suggest watching this video from NoClip that discusses the topic from a perspective with far more experience in publishing, game development, and even with Animal Well itself than I have. Basically, there are ways that Dunkey could run his publishing company that would be potentially damaging to the games he publishes, but there are also outcomes where it's purely and greatly beneficial to those games, and I think we'll just have to see how it turns out. What would the games industry look like if everyone making games was a clone of yourself? I'm going to answer this question as if my clones only took my tastes and creative sensibilities, rather than my work ethic or actual development skills. I assume there would be a lot of changes, but to name a few, a good number of genres would probably completely cease to exist, like JRPGs, grand strategies, pure visual novels, and probably many more. The number of sequels being made would probably decrease drastically, though spiritual successors or just games that are heavily inspired by others would probably be even more common. Games on average would probably be a lot simpler in terms of game design and narrative design, though in my view that would result in more cohesive, controlled experiences generally. Those are just a few that I thought of, but applying this scenario to anyone would obviously result in massive changes that are too numerous to mention all of them. How do you think the implementation of AI will affect games in general? AI is obviously the big topic that's being discussed in tech circles at the moment, and I think the games industry is probably a sector that will be affected less than others, though that does depend on how the technology develops. The big issue with implementing language models like ChatGPT or visual models like Stable Diffusions into the games themselves is that they're very expensive to run, whether that be in terms of processing power on a user's local computer or in terms of money if the developers run the process on their servers. Unless the required specs for those processes are lowered significantly, I find it more likely that AI will mostly be used for the development process, rather than being part of the user experience. This will affect developers in the same way that language models will affect writers and programmers in general, and in the same way that visual models will affect artists in general. One part of this that I think is really positive is how AI will affect modding games. I recently started a playthrough of Morrowind using an AI upscaled texture pack, and it really helps to maintain the aesthetic of the game while providing a higher quality look. But the more interesting prospect for me is that AI voice mimicry may become good enough to replace both amateur voice acting, as well as mods that just neglect to add voice acting where it would usually be. But overall, I'm not as worried about AI in general as many people seem to be, and the games industry is probably going to be less impacted than other tech fields, so I'm optimistic about it if anything. How does it feel to have a very small but dedicated community of viewers? I thought this would be a good question to end on, in part because it wraps up this sort of celebration of what I've been slowly building with this channel, but it's also something I think about a lot. If I had it my way, I would just post videos whenever I felt like it, and have very minimal interaction with whatever audience I had. I don't want to have me as a person as the selling point of my channel. I really only want to put out my work and let people enjoy it if they want to. But that isn't very conducive to growth on this platform, especially when you're starting from basically nothing like I did. I knew I wouldn't suddenly explode in popularity unless I got particularly lucky, and while I've had a few boosts here and there from Fez being announced for the Switch and riding the short-lived Ultra Deluxe popularity wave, there hasn't been a really big one for me as of yet. In some ways that's a positive for me, and I think if I ever do find that big success story, I'll look back on these first few years of my channel's life with a sense of nostalgia. I know I could grow faster by writing trends and talking about the big topics of the day, but I always knew if I got into content creation, I would want to work on my own terms and talk about the things I find the most interesting, and by carving out that niche, I might still grow at a reasonable pace. So far, I've been content with the results of my venture, and I'm interested to see where things can go from here. Thanks to everyone who supported my work over the past few years, and I hope I'll have something new to show you soon.